So to put aside difficult pasts. But by doing that, they were also creating new difficult pasts. So there's a dilemma at play here. And we need to look at the legacies of 1798 and the United Irishmen. And I say legacies in the plural because there's not one legacy. There's many legacies. To pick up on something that Peter said in my previous book, one of my previous books, I looked at a different arena years ago. I looked at 1798 in the west of Ireland. Different set of sources. Most of my sources were folklore sources in Irish. I had to learn Irish for it. I had to spend time in Mayo, Galway, Connemara, all the way through to Longford, following what happens with these traditions. But if you look at the two covers of the book, they'll show you how they're two different books, supposedly dealing with the same topic. One is more about memory in the open, which ends up with big parades after 100 years. About celebration and the story of kind of a rising nationalism coming out of it. Whereas in Ulster, it's a story which has its moments in public, but often has its moments in private. So it's a story on the one hand of folk history and social memory. When we come to Ulster, we have to look at something more complicated. Of vernacular historiography, which I've explained, and social forgetting. So with that in mind, let's go back to 1798. In this room, I feel comfortable enough not to explain the rebellion. We'd need 10 minutes at least for that, at least. And I assume most people know about the rebellion. But the important thing to realize is, and I think that's also well known in this room, but at least since the work of Tony Stewart it's quite clear, this was a set of a series of rebellions. It had different character in different areas. We can argue how much they're connected or not connected. It's a political question to some level. Tony Stewart would have argued that the rebellion in Ulster was on a different planet almost. I'm not sure about that. But it was different arenas. There's an arena, the main arena of 1798 is the area of South East Leinster, Wexford, Wicklow, the areas around Dublin. At the very end of the summer, there's the French invasion, what happens in Mayo. An interesting story as well in terms of how it was remembered afterwards. But Ulster, counties Antrim and Down, and parts of Derry, Londonderry, was often dismissed as being very short. It was only a week, supposedly. There were things that went beyond the week, but it was a week, a very violent week. And if you look at the official historiography of this week, you'll find time and time again this week is dismissed in history books. Time and time again it said, yes, there was a rebellion, but it was nothing. It came and went. It's a blink. It's just a little blimp in history. It doesn't mean anything. And you can still see this in books which come out nowadays, even after the bicentennial, even after all the literature we have about it. And that's misleading, because the more you look at it, this is a map from Tony Stewart's book, across Antrim and Down, so many conflicts, so many places. It was a very, very bloody conflict. It cut very, very deep. It left a legacy which went many years afterwards. So it's much more than that. First of all, it can't be belittled. Belittling it was a political project. And there was an attempt to do this. It was a polemic. We've got to realize the politics behind belittling it. So first of all, it's a much larger scale than it seems. The other thing is, we're all aware probably in this room, is there's a different composition of forces in each of the rebellions. The backbone of the rebellion in the north are the dissenters, the Presbyterians of Ulster Scots background. There were lots of Catholics. There was a certain amount, very hard to determine, of various churches, but Church of Ireland, various Protestant churches, but specifically Church of Ireland. But specifically, the people behind the rebellion in the north were the Presbyterians of Antrim and Down. And this makes an interesting case study relating to the issues I talked about before. Why? And this might be obvious to all of us, but let's just illustrate it quickly by taking the case of Ballynahinch, just so I can show it visually. I can show it about any corner in Antrim and Down. If we look at Ballynahinch, for example. So Ballynahinch, in 1798, the famous painting by Robinson, a period painting, comes out shortly after the rebellion. This is an attempt of official history to determine what happened. It's an official representation. It was painted for the ascendancy. It even imitates an image of the period which is well known. It's built on the template of those who know Wolfe's death in Quebec, in the taking of Quebec. So he's copying Benjamin West's famous painting from North America, which is well known because it was circulating here in different cheap forms. So we see here, this is about the victors telling their story of history and the casualties that they paid. We're the rebels here. In the background, green flag in the background if we go for it. But of course there's a rebel here as well. Hugh McCullough. A rebel who is being dragged to be hung on a windmill. A rebel, by the way, whose brother, a rebel colonel, United Irish colonel, whose brother is in the yeomanry. And that's something we see time and time again. It hasn't been properly studied, how much the rebellion was actually a civil war. And that's another point, which is more complicated. But we do see the masses that turned out in huge numbers to take part in this rebellion. But if we go back to the same area sometime later, we'll see a different picture, because something happens after the rebellion. And that's the Act of Union. Once the rebellion is suppressed, the Act of Union is passed. And there's an incentive for Presbyterians and Protestant communities in general, and this is being pushed very strongly, to change their politics. So people will move from republicanism as it was at the end of the 18th century, a bit different from republicanism today. Not totally unrelated, but a bit different. To move towards unionism, a new ideology, towards loyalism, a more established ideology, towards Orangism. So if we were to visit Ballynahinch later in the 19th century, we'd see scenes like this. Orange marches. And those marching in the parades would often be people who had formerly been United Irishmen. Or, a few years later, their children. And a few years later, their grandchildren. All the way to the present day. So we have centres of unionism and loyalism throughout the 19th century and the 20th century, which at the end of the late 18th century were actually pockets of radical republicanism. And so here we see the incentive of social forgetting. You have an event which no longer coincides or no longer matches your current politics. What do you do with it? You have an incentive to forget it, but how do you forget it? Now, I have a lot to say about this, and we'll see how far we can go from this point onwards, because I've already taken a lot of time, I've realized, much more than I thought. So we'll run through a few things, but this is how we disremember 1798. So let's just give a few examples. And I'll rush through this quickly, because this is the gist of the talk, but I wanted to give you the full background. The rest you can get from the book, more or less. But how are people keeping? Because it's quite warm in here. I mean, are you okay? Can we take... Do we have some time? Should we take... Shall I give 15 minutes more of... Because from now on I've got a lot to say, but I'll lead you through things as we go along. Just to show how you work with vernacular historiography to unlock social forgetting. So if you go to areas which are strongly unionist and in their politics would constantly vote for unionist candidates, and you think they'd completely forgotten the United Irish heritage, look at the material culture and you'll find scenes like this. You'll find people will keep in their house. You know, the pike in the thatch is an old Republican trope, isn't it? Appears in songs, a Fenian trope. But people actually had pikes, and still have pikes, some of them. And swords and cannonballs and bullet pieces. This family over here, George and James Gray McCartney from Six Roads Ends, keeping a whole set of dishes and cutlery which are attributed to Betsy Gray, County Down folk heroine. Did she exist? Didn't she? That's a different question, but the pieces are being kept as relics of 1798 and of the United Irishmen. A woman in Portaferry who holds this silk handkerchief, which actually goes back to the centenary, but becomes a relic through which you can tell stories of McCracken, of William Orr, of Henry Monroe. So all these kind of relics kept in houses of unionist households, which are quite remarkable. So that's one way of accessing it, through material culture, the stories told about material culture and relics. Something we've got to be aware of is the whole notion of social forgetting is you always talk about it in a skewered way, through a glass darkly, if you wish, in a kind of, you cover it up as you talk about it. So you need to get used to euphemisms, something we're all well familiar with in Northern Ireland. It's a society loaded with euphemisms, probably more than any other society I know. But the classic case in this case would be the various names with which 98 was referred to. One of them being the turnout. Not the only, probably the most popular, but there were many other terms. It was even referred to, by the way, as the Troubles. It was the Troubles of then. So it's interesting how the term Troubles is recycled again and again in history. But the turnout is interesting. And just to show how vernacular history can tell us about the turnout. So you can find, for example, the writings of Samuel McSkimmon. Samuel McSkimmon, the historian of Antrim, is an amateur historian. He's not an official historian. He's an antiquarian. He's a shopkeeper in Carrickfergus. Even how he gets to Carrickfergus is interesting, because he comes from Ballyclare. But he was fingered as an informer, which he always thought was a grievance. He said this was wrong, but that's a different point. And he escapes to Carrickfergus. And he joins the yeomanry. And he takes part in suppressing the rebels. And that lays heavy on his conscience. It took me a long time to understand what's happening there, because it troubles him all the time. on his deathbed, he tells the story of how he still can't forgive himself for burning down the Doak Book Club. Because the Doak Book Club in County Antrim was where he learned to read and write, and it was a model library of the Enlightenment. And that was his own place. But he was sent there with a party of yeomanry and they destroyed the place. So he took part in an atrocity. He had friends on the other side. He'd write afterwards under a pseudonym or with his initials, a travel book of rambles through Antrim 10 years after the rebellion. And each place he goes to, he's haunted by memories of places where he knows people that he knew. And he was involved in killing them. His obituary is remarkable. Perhaps written by Thomas Davis, it's not clear. In The Nation, one of his obituaries when he dies, where he says, his store of traditions was great. He used to go walking about the county Antrim, gossiping with the people. The only way, in his opinion, to come at the truth from the poorer people, who were up in 98, was to make them free with drink. And this way, he said, he laid out a good deal of money for his information. So he's plying people with drink to get from them stories of 98. And he compiles these stories. But he can't publish them because there's a public culture of silence which he's implicated in. So when he writes his history of Carrickfergus, which is a history of Antrim, each edition he slips in a little bit more. But he can't tell too much. It's all a work of social forgetting, slowly challenging his own boundaries. At first he says in Carrickfergus there was nothing. He knows that William Orr was executed in Carrickfergus. He knows the story of Carrickfergus. But he can't take it out, bit by bit. And the whole time he's writing a book about 1798, which he can't publish. It comes out posthumously. And when it does come out, his Annals of Ulster or Ireland 50 years ago, it's not even called 1798. Only later, the whole book is about 1798. And traditions which he collected always from a loyalist perspective. With a huge bias, but rich in traditions. And if you read that, you'll find a footnote where he explains. In speaking of this insurrection, which is very rarely called a rebellion, but commonly called the turnout. The call used at the time to those who appeared tardy to come forth to the ranks. Now I find this interesting on many levels, but just as a hint here. Look at the ambiguity. It's the turnout was a term used for those who were tardy to come out. They were reluctant rebels. That's a narrative which is throughout folklore and folk traditions. It's a way of dealing with an episode which you're uncomfortable with. Yes, my father rebelled, but he didn't really want to rebel. He had to. They went with great enthusiasm in 98, but afterwards when you tell the tale again, it becomes a more ambiguous story. Even then it was an ambiguous story from the beginning. So it's quite interesting in that sense. Just to show how the turnout appears in vernacular sources, let's take a less familiar case. Adam Lynn, a poet, less known poet from Cullibackie, near Ballymena, mid-Antrim. He wrote in Ulster Scots verse, and he wrote in unionist newspapers. He was a unionist. So he's not the likely topic. He's not the kind of poet. There's lots of poets who wrote about 98, like James Orr and others who are familiar to us. It's the ones who are less familiar which took a lot of effort to get to. So when you find Adam Lynn, where I did find his relevant verses, it's in his collection Random Rhymes. He has a poem called The 12th of July. It's a poem about the 12th of July, the last place you'd expect to see something about United Irishmen. I might need some help here. Is anybody here okay with Ulster Scots dialect? Can somebody help me here? Because otherwise I'm going to savage it, which will be terrible. If somebody can do it, it'll be much better for nobody's going to raise to the challenge here?
It's relevant, anybody can make up what they need.
That's one perspective. Others wouldn't agree with that. I'm not going to go down that minefield. But look at the verses here. I'll translate it if you wish, even though we can work it out. So, few of us men from the Scots to remember, mind. Few of us men, the turn out fecht. Now we know it's pronounced, the turn out fecht, that was fought, that took place here in 98. I would not like to be overstretched, right? I wouldn't want to deal with it too much. But ye all ken from know, again Scots. The civil side had nae the wecht for sugar men. The civil side, the people, couldn't defeat the soldiers. So there's a whole verse here about not being able to remember 98, embedded in a poem about the 12th of July. And the more you look at it, there's so many cases like that, of poets writing about how you can't write about it and write about it all the same. In coded forms. And that's a lot what social forgetting is about euphemism and coded forms. That those who understand, and outsiders don't. And therefore you don't have to be afraid of censorship. Censorship is not even an issue. It's not going to bother anybody. So that's a way of remembering 98. So much more. I'm hesitant what to show, but we'll keep on going. For example,